Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much for coming. I was assigned the topic of my postdoc, which is the work which I'm conducting on James Dundas' Idea philosophiae moralis, the recently discovered manuscript of someone who we now know was also a philosopher. And I have chosen the topic of free will. This is work in progress, tentative, so any suggestions are welcome. There are quite a few images. If you get bored, you can just, I've chosen something of high quality. This is the content. I'm going through some biographical notes on James Dundas, the man, because it's important to know why his life matters for the understanding of his philosophy. In particular, the event with the Restoration of Charles II. Then I'm going through the character of the Medea in philosophical moral reflections. Then John Duns Scotus, John Cameron, how they influenced, and how James Dundas, and how he, what he makes of their positions. Then I will go through his anthropology and theory of moral decision-making, and then I'll try and draft some conclusions. Apologies, in a way, for reading out my presentation, but I thought that, given the degree of complexity of some of the matters, it was better for me to actually read it out. James Dundas was born around 1620 in the noble family of the Dundases in Mid Lothian, south of Edinburgh. He entered St. Leonard's College in St. Andrews in 1635, aged 15. That was an interesting choice. Further away than the University of Edinburgh, St. Andrews was the oldest and most prestigious of the Scottish universities, and also the one more clearly associated with the Reformation. There he studied philosophy in the tradition of Reformed scholasticism. His regent was the Presbyterian James Guthrie. Loyal to his family's Presbyterian tradition, Dundas signed the National Covenant on the 12th of December 1639, shortly after finishing university. He became an elder of the Kirk of Scotland in 1640, and he was for some time an MP for Mid Lothian after 1648. Without formal training in the law, he became a judge in 1660 and a member, as Lord Arniston, of the High Court of Justice, Scotland's highest judicial body. Then came the Restoration, rhetorical pose. On the 4th of April 1660 in England and on the 14th of May 1660 in Scotland, Charles II was proclaimed king. The Scottish Parliament was summoned again in 1661. In one of its first decisions, the Rescissory Act of 1661, the Parliament abrogated all laws between the 1630s and 1660. The time between Charles I and Charles II became an interregnum. Along with the Stuart dynasty, Episcopalianism was re-established in the attempt to erase from Scottish conscience what many believed was the cause of the Civil War, the Presbyterian-inspired National Covenant. In 1637, before the National Covenant, the events were precipitated by the so-called Laudian reforms. The attempt, orchestrated by Charles I and Archbishop Laud, to bring the churches of Scotland and England together by imposing a new book of canons and a modified book of common prayer. For those who believed in Presbyterianism and in the primacy of the synods of the Kirk in matters religious, the king-driven and parliament-sanctioned restoration sounded like imposition. All the reasons that were there to reject it in 1638 were still there in 1660. What's in the National Covenant, which was scrapped by the Rescissory Act? The document is both doctrinal and political. It is at the intersection of faith and politics that we find James Dundas' remonstrations against Charles II. Throughout the document, the Stuart dynasty is reminded that, quote, the Confession of Faith of the Kirk of Scotland was subscribed at first by the King's Majesty and his household in the year of God 1580, end of quote, and that all kings and princes at their coronation and reception of their princely authority shall make the faithful promise to defend the freedom of the Kirk of Scotland and its doctrine. This is a very close paraphrasis. The Stuart dynasty had promised to defend Presbyterianism, According to many, including James Dundas, in 1661 the Stuarts forfaulted on their promise. On the 7th of August 1663, the Scottish Parliament passed an act against the Covenanters that no one who had not offered a formal renunciation of the Covenant shall exerce any public trust or office. This directly affected Dundas. Negotiation ensued between Dundas and Lord Lauderdale, who acted as representative of Charles II. Dundas negotiated his way during the years 1663 and 1664 with a vivid memory of his university teacher James Guthrie being hanged and his head displayed on the city walls at the Netherwell Port in Edinburgh, fortunately there is no picture of that, for several months after the execution, and of Archibald Johnson of Warriston, co-author of the National Covenant, executed in the same year of 1663. Ultimately, Dundas refused to sign the renunciation. A final offer to renounce publicly with a private oral salvo was made, but in June 64, Dundas, despite further insistence by the other members of the judiciary, stood firm on his demand of a public written qualification. Now, you must be wondering why I've told you all this. After the fateful year of 1664, Dundas retired to the management of his family estate and to polite learning, essentially exile. He eventually died in October 1679. His exile from public life bore a philosophical fruit. In the final 6 months of his life, Dundas wrote his philosophical testament, the Idea Philosophiae Moralis, a 313-page unfinished treatise in Reformed scholastic moral philosophy, the most detailed moral treatise to come to us from 17th century Scotland. This important find was made just a few years ago in the same library where Dundas used to live and work. I believe that these short biographical notes help set the stage for the investigation of his philosophy. The Idea can be seen, as I like to do, as Dundas' systematic reflections on a decision to question his faith and ultimately change his life. The decision to resist the king and to stand firm by his signature of the National Covenant. In what follows, I present the existential import of the concept of free will and of moral agency in the thought of James Dundas. Since antiquity, Medea has been the personification of akrasia, the performing of an act against our own better judgment. Here there are a collection of representations of the Medea. Delacroix, Pasolini in the only movie appearance by Maria Callas, Mucha, early 20th century or late 19th century, and the Medea by Sandys in 1868. The inventor of the tragic episode of the infanticide, Euripides, makes Medea say that I know what evil I propose to do, but anger rules my deliberations. Ovid's Medea in the Metamorphoses cries that video meliora proboque, deteriora sequor. I know the good and I approve of it, but I do evil. Dundas learned the story of Medea from Ovid. This is a case of his literary education prompting his philosophical reflections on good, evil, and the human powers. Dundas deploys the scholastic theory of mind in the analysis of Medea. The mind comprises two faculties, the intellect and the will. The objects are presented to the practical intellect as good or evil. The practical intellect is the intellect when it applies itself to practical matters. The perception of the intellect is always mediated and accompanied by habits, passions, and desires. The will is the motive faculty which sets the action in motion. Dundas writes that Medea committed a sin against conscience because she acted against her practical absolute judgment, which is, I know the good and I approve it, when she acted according to her practical comparative judgment. Anger rules my deliberations, the universal versus the individual. Whereas the absolute judgment is about right and wrong, the comparative judgment is about immediate advantage and pleasure, such as the urge to satisfy our anger. Medea's acratic decision then would lie in the inability of the will to follow the good presented by the intellect. there is not much room for acrosia in the intellectualist theories of moral agency of Socrates, Aristotle, and the Stoics. With Paul's letter to the Romans, in particular chapter 8, and with Augustine, one witnesses the resurgence of the commonplace Platonic view of a struggle between desires and passions on the one side and reason on the other side. According to Plato, acrosia occurs when passions are stronger than reason, hence what we call irrational behavior. According to Augustine, because of the corruption of human nature, the will is always responsible for choosing, or at least not withholding, the acratic action. Lack of willpower in Plato, voluntary sin in Augustine. Two very different anthropologies. The moral philosophy of John Duns Scotus is a constant critical reference for James Dundas. We will see later Scotus on the identity of intellect and will. Scotus's fundamental intuition is voluntarism. Freedom and moral responsibility all lie with the will, the higher faculty of human agency. Scotus is the thinker of the radical contingency of all created things, because their existence ultimately rests on God's willing them into existence. As pale and weak as it is when compared to God's will, the created will has a specific and unique power. For Scotus, a defining feature of the created will is indifference. Indifference can be of specification and of action. Indifference of the will with respect to specification means that the will's decision is not determined when it is confronted with a given thing, action, or event susceptible of being subject to moral consideration. Indifference of the will with respect to action or execution means that the will can withhold carrying out the action even after the decision to act is made. The radicality of the faculty of the will is that in the course of forming a moral syllogism, and even in the course of carrying out an action, the will can always retain the power to think and do otherwise. Indifference of the will seems like an intuitive view. If we introspect when we produce the practical judgment to act or when we act, we experience a sort of possibility opening up to us, the agents. To contemplate different possible courses of action even after the decision for one specific course of action is made. To do or not to do that specific action while the action is being performed. Many saw the essence of freedom precisely in this opening up of a space of possibility, as we have seen earlier, within and over and above the empirical, visible sequence which can account for decision-making from an external third person point of view. A succession of conditions, stimulus, desire, execution, effect. According to Dundas, the reductionist vocabulary of materialistic philosophy is Hobbes' contention and greatest error at once. That moral agency is a matter of desire and execution, material cause and material effect, and chiefly self-preservation. For Scotus, indifference is essential to the will, but it is a potency, not a principle of action. Like Buridan's us, we do not act on indifference. According to Scotus, the will suspends this radical indifference and chooses a course of action on two competing principles: what is materially advantageous and useful, and the more noble principle of justice. Psychological determinism can describe our response to the affections of pleasure and usefulness. We are so strongly inclined to satisfy them. Beyond our material advantage, we can act on what is just. It is a principle of justice which guides the will to the good and which elevates it above the mere determination to seek our own happiness. In this new sense, happiness would equate with material happiness. Yet, Scotus believes that the experience of the will's openness to possibilities is still there. If the will were not free to reject the intellect's conclusion or even the principle of justice, then the agent would not be truly free. There is no real moral action without freedom and voluntariness. Scotus then concludes that, quote, a free will is not bound in every way to seek happiness. Akrasia is then explained as the, quote, inordinate desire for our own happiness. We seek only what we see good, and error lies in seeking evil mistaken as good. Contrary to Aquinas, error is not just a mistake in understanding what the object of our moral conduct ought to be. From a voluntaristic perspective, error is also in wanting a good thing at the wrong moment, or for the wrong reasons. Scotus's intuition that the right or proper will is crucial to moral agency will speak volumes in Reformed theology. Luther and Calvin will contend that if the harmony between intellect and will, for example, when we act according to the law of God, might mean that we have acted voluntarily, it does not imply that we have willed or acted freely. A free will is one which acts on the right motives, and the right motives are not available to us in the post-lapsarian state without God's assistance. Voluntariness, finally, divorced from freedom. As well as a humanist, Dundas was also, as we have seen, a fervent Calvinist. In moral agency, Dundas's Calvinism was influenced by the Glasgow-born John Cameron, an influential theologian active in Glasgow and above all in France in the first half of the 17th century. You've seen he has traveled quite a lot and taking up very many academic positions. Cameron is a key protagonist of French and European Calvinism as well as of the early modern Scottish diaspora. Dundas takes from our Cameron, as he calls him, the doctrine that the will necessarily follows the ultimate practical judgment of the intellect, when the intellect is illuminated by grace. Freedom is, from the point of view of decision and execution, according to Cameron, placed in the activity of the practical intellect. As soon as the intellect formulates a practical proposition of, say, doing X is good, this proposition is already judged as worth willing. Vaguely reminiscent of the Stoics' theory of mind, for Cameron the apprehension of the good involves the assent to the good. Since the nature of the will is to seek the good presented as good, by definition, the will necessarily follows the intellect which presents a certain good as good. Admittedly, Dundas and Cameron are in the minority in holding this view in the 17th century. So notable was Cameron's position that Leibniz felt compelled to mention it in the Theodicea. I now turn to the exposition of Dundas's anthropology, of his interpretation of Cameron, and to his arguments for a compatibilist view of moral agency. Why was Cameron's and Dundas's a minority position? Dundas writes that the general consensus was that there is some sort of indifference of the will. He mentions the Scotists, the Thomists, the Lutherans, the Jesuits, the Arminians. He doesn't mention the Cartesians, but I can also add the Cartesians to the list. What everyone agreed on is that indifference is a relational concept. The will is indifferent with respect to something, towards something. Things and the will in themselves are not indifferent because they are created, hence, to a certain extent, theologically oriented. According to Dundas, the great majority of theologians and philosophers sided with John Duns Scotus in holding that indifference is with respect to both specification and action. The Thomists, instead, famously claim that it is only with respect to action. What does Dundas say against the indifference of the will? He offers some clever arguments which guide us in the unfolding of his theory of mind. Indifference towards good and evil is not required for a moral action because, if we look at the example of morality, God, we find that he cannot not act morally. Otherwise, he would contradict his own perfectly rational nature. Hence, he's not indifferent to good and evil. Unless we are prepared to deny freedom in God, then we have to conclude that indifference is not required. Indifference towards good and evil is not required for the moral action because otherwise the conceptual premise for moral action would not be there. Imagine a situation in which after some moral reflection, the intellect has not yet decided where the good is. Acting on such a limited evidence would be morally blind, hence culpable. The right thing to do would be to withhold the action. Indifference towards good and evil is not required because indifference presupposes ignorance. Hence, the following argument. The more the uncertainty, the more the indifference. The more the indifference, the less the knowledge. The less the knowledge, the less the freedom. This runs counter to our intuition of what negative freedom is, to do what I want. The idea that freedom is essentially self-determinations, no strings attached. We now get to Dundas' definition of freedom. Freedom is agreeableness with reason, lubentia cum ratione in the Latin. The will is appetite with reason. By definition, then, reason has to be there somewhere in the free will. A free appetite with reason, perhaps? A free action is an action carried out by an internal principle of knowing and willing, scienter et volenter in the Latin. When either of the conditions fails to obtain, the action is not free. Knowing the good and coherently acting on this knowledge is the essence of freedom. This is why the less the knowledge, the less the freedom. As John Cameron taught, freedom is in the practical intellect because it is the intellect which apprehends the good, understands the good, and presents the good to the will. The job of the will is to follow on this knowledge. Dundas is an intellectualist in moral agency. Yet the objection of the indifference of the will remains. We do experience that the will can withhold the execution of the action even after the best of judgments. That seems like psychological evidence to us. What role is there for Medea's acrasia in Dundas' theory of action? Dundas acknowledges that we do have the psychological experience of indifference. But he offers a metaphysical argument against indifference being a real power in moral agency. If the will can actually withhold the action, then it is the will alone which is the cause of the action. Though seemingly acceptable, this conclusion cannot be ultimately held. Such a cause, the will as a total cause of moral acting, would be arbitrary because it could potentially act contrary or indifferent to good reasons. Such a will would not be different from blind desire, which is not required to have a reasonable justification. This is a point that he makes against Thomas Hobbes. We have the intuition that having the proper desires is part of a full moral life. But when desires are divorced from reasonableness, good habits, continence, and prudence, they are not by themselves worthy of unconditional moral approval. If it is the case that will can withhold the action, then the very notion of causality in moral philosophy is in jeopardy. Not only causality in the sense of being the author of such and such an action, or broadly speaking, moral responsibility. Dundas works with the notion of causality, which is typical of scholastic philosophy. Causality as a logical necessitation relation. That a cause logically necessitates means that when the total cause of the action obtains, it is impossible, that is, contradictory, that the effect, that is, the action, does not follow. The total cause of the action is the co-occurrence of the material and mental requisites in the agent. That I want to do something, that I think that this something is good, that I have the physical powers to do it, that I'm in the right conditions to do it. The divine decree and the divine predetermination. On this understanding, as a necessary part of a sufficient cause, the failure of the will to act would be a logical contradiction, that is, an impossibility. Hence, considering that it is an impossibility, a different explanation of our experience of indifference, which is undeniable, has to be given. If the will does not act on the practical judgment of the intellect, then the practical judgment is not conclusive. As moral agents, we have simply failed to produce a moral syllogism and an action. The experience of indifference is the experience of a moral judgment in the making, whose companions are still ignorance, uncertainty, and doubt. A final argument by Dundas concerns the goal of prayers. When people pray that God changes their minds or that he brings about a desired effect, Dundas argues people do not pray that God forces their assent and thus eliminates their freedom. They rather pray that God brings about the total cause of the desired effect, part of which is our free will. A will which necessarily follows the intellect. I think this argument is quite good. A clear debt to John Donne's Scotus is in the idea of the profound unity of the mind. Only a distinction of reason obtains between intellect and will. On Scotus's understanding, the identity of intellect and will is declined in voluntaristic terms. The will is the higher faculty, the spring and root of man's existential dimensions. Dundas, on the contrary, is an intellectualist. From within the Scotistic intellectual resources, and in keeping with his Calvinist belief in the intrinsic corruption of human nature, I believe that the identity of intellect and will and psychological determinism made sense for Dundas as a guarantee, as a wall against will's sinful fancies and pretended independence. Moral agency and freedom are part of a much greater story. Essential to concurrentism is the idea that God is part of the total cause of an action, as we have just seen. Unlike in occasionalism, though, creatures are real causes in moral agency. Hence, and not just occasions for God's acting. Hence, the need to combine necessity and free will, where free will is more than the illusion of it, as in occasionalism. Dundas argues for a compatibilist view of moral agency. The basic distinction is between physical or natural necessity and moral or rational necessity. Physical necessity is the natural determination of a thing ad unum, towards the one. Dundas makes example of fire, which in his Aristotelian cosmology always moves upwards towards the celestial spheres. Fire is not free to move in any other direction. Dundas writes that necessitas non habet legem. Necessity does not know the law. Law here is not used in the sense of nomological necessity or physical laws, but rather in the sense proper to the natural law tradition of a law as the manifestation of an authoritative will by way of manifest norms and rules. The law issued by the highest authority, God, is the highest law. A law is always a moral item. Without the law there is no right and wrong, hence no rewards and punishments. Such a law presupposes a recipient, us, endowed with reason and will to understand it and perform on it. But also, without freedom, the law would be in vain. Dundas does not seem to have our contemporary understanding of laws as a description of nature's regularities, which assumes nomological necessity, that is, a necessity at least limited to and valid in the specific possible world described by physics. Human agents are subject to physical necessity only in their physiological functions, in bodily lives, the animal, vegetative, and sensitive, as Aristotle would say, not in their moral life, hence Hobbes' reductionist mistake. Unlike fire, we are not reduced to one thing, ad unum, and always retain a plurality of goals available. What of the objection that they are necessarily directed to the good? Isn't it a type of external determination? Why can't we will evil? The objection fails for two reasons. The objection that there is a necessitation towards the good. First, if the good is intended as a relative good, then there are many of them different for each one of us. That's an old Aristotelian argument. Whereas there is only one heavens for the fire to move towards. Secondly, if the good, as Dundas understands it, is the good, God, then we are determined to it, but not necessitated to it. This is why, as creatures subjects to God, we are not completely free from at least some form of necessity, namely moral or rational necessity. This is the bottom rock foundation of compatibilism in Dundas. Two senses of this necessity are invoked here. Formally, the good apprehended as good compels our judgment and action in the conscience. We have to act according to what we judge to be the good, even if the possibility of being wrong is impossible to rule out. This is why acting against our conscience is, in a way, acting against God's will. Materially, the moral law given by God compels our assent. The moral law is both formally and materially the good. The moral law is how things are, how God willed them to be. Dundas says that the first rule of morals is God's rational nature, and that the second rule of morals is our own created rational nature. What things are is a fundamental necessity beyond our power to change. We are not less free because of this fundamental necessity in our moral life, if not in a trivial sense, as one could say today, that I'm presently not free to jump a mile high because of gravity. The dual moral and metaphysical dimension of the moral law is thus apparent. We live in a morally oriented universe, pace Hobbes. Neither are we, as Dundas says, damnati ad bonum, damned to do the good. Scotus had said that our will does not necessarily seek happiness, and had placed this freedom in the pursuit of justice. Dundas argues that the only physical coercion, vis in Latin, is incompatible with freedom. We are not coerced by the law of nature. In its physical sense, it is besides moral considerations. In its moral sense, we are determined by it. That is, we are convinced by it. Freedom ultimately lies in doing the good, and the good is the truth. Omnis actio bona est libera. Every good action is essentially free. I added essentially, but that makes sense. How much and how well do we know what we ought to do? Because that's another objection that comes out to this view. For Dundas' intellectualist position, this question is especially pressing. Dundas here fully accepts the anthropological evidence of the intrinsic corruption of our mental faculties after the original fall, a source of corruption which inevitably affects us as moral agents. The appeal of psychological determinism lies in its capacity to address the problem of human corruption. The realm of possible truths available to us is thus demarcated into two. On the one side, the physical truths open to empirical investigation. On the other side, the moral sphere, whose content is in the law of God, given to us in the gospel, and in the sparks of knowledge naturally present in our mind, like the sensus divinitatis, for example, in Calvin. This evidence makes us inexcusable. I believe that Dundas here reveals a tendency towards a sort of deontology of the law. As created beings, our duty is to respect God's law out of gratitude. I wonder about the possible role of his covenanting theology here. The moral imperative to abide by the law is a remedy to the feebleness of our intellectual powers. Moral motivation is a derivative concept for Dundas. It follows from the authority of the lawgiver and from the rationality of the law given. In keeping with his intellectualism, Dundas thus places error in a lack of knowing and understanding, not in an inconsequential relationship between intellect and will, which fails to produce the good action. Freedom is not a power of the will to withhold assent and execution, but rather an unimpeded voluntary, willing movement coming from within the agent. There is no intellectual bit of the moral action which might or might not be followed by the voluntary bit. The understanding of the moral action is holistic, grounded in the unity of intellect and will. Corruption and sin, and that's a fundamental point, are from the start of the process. They do not make their appearance when the will messes things up and fails to do what is good, like Medea did. Error and sin are in not knowing what is good, and the knowing is the premise of the moral action. I'll dare some conclusions. In elaborating his position, Dundas was in dialogue with diverse moral traditions. From Augustine, Paul, Scotus, and the Calvinists, an odd bunch, he took the awareness of the fallibility and total dependence of human beings from God. Especially important is the holistic approach to the mind, which is central in Paul. From John Duns Scotus, Dundas took the fundamental intuition of the unity of intellect and will, but rejected his indifferentism and voluntarism. He's closer to John Cameron's intellectualism and psychological determinism, though he makes a fundamental distinction there. For Cameron, the will necessarily follows the intellect when the intellect is illuminated by God. That is, only when it is, by definition, right. For Dundas, this is instead current epistemology in our everyday life. That's a fundamental difference. For the Stoics, he took the idea that the judgment of the intellect is performative of the action, that the judgment is already willing that action, and in a way performing it, performative. From Aristotle, he developed the idea of free as voluntary, and the general description of free will, something agreeable to the judgment towards our natural end, not physically determined, though regulated by reason. These are Dundas's words. Identity of faculties within an intellectualist theory of action, concurrentism, compatibilism, and a Calvinist negative anthropology. A brief remark on Dundas's reading of Hobbes imposes itself. You have heard Hobbes' name quite a few times today. The differences between the two might be less important than one might expect. Unlike Hobbes, Dundas argued that mental faculties are not mere physiological processes, and that moral agents are subject to a law higher than physical determinism. Like Hobbes, though, Dundas was a compatibilist in moral agency. Beyond the unquestionable rejection of materialism by Dundas, he shares with Hobbes the intuition that the will is necessitated by antecedent factors. The intellect for Dundas, desires for Hobbes. With Luther and Calvin, they share the suspicion of Catholic and Arminian libertarianism, and they seem to find psychological determinism theologically sound. This was the big contention that Bramhall made against Hobbes, that effectively he would destroy the notion of freedom. They seem to converge on a concept of free will as voluntariness. They reject the idea of will as an autonomous power, a cause unlike any other. Freedom as an original, unprecedented, new causal beginning in the course of nature, as later immortalized by Immanuel Kant. Dundas's philosophy is very much a product of his Calvinist faith and of the events which marked his life. It is obviously possible, though somehow artificial, to separate the man and the philosopher. When one reads the Idea as a philosophical elaboration on the events of 1663 and 1664, its spirit and existential import are most evident. How do philosophy and life coincide in James Dundas? Given the theory of mind and compatibilism presented in the Idea, Dundas arguably felt that his assent to what he believed to be the truth, the national covenant, was binding in the conscience to the point of being an unchangeable assent. It was not in his power to revert the decision. In his philosophy, truth is not within our powers to determine or alter. One of the recurrent critiques of Hobbes that he makes is that he turns truth into a matter of custom, convention, and mere material advantage. Dundas was alien to this view. Free will is truly free when it assents to the good, and the highest good is to serve God, not Charles II. Material advantage is desirable, but not at all essential to the truth. Near the end of his life, Dundas must have reflected on his dramatic decision and arguably found comfort in theological and moral philosophical arguments that his decision was the right one. Hence, the biographical importance of the existential themes in the idea, free will, fallibility of man, individuality, the relationship between creature and God. Also, Dundas was in constant and intimate dialogue with John Duns Scotus, the great Scottish theologian and philosopher, and John Cameron, a leading theologian in the Scottish diaspora in France. From his library in Arniston House, which had become such a great part of his life, James Dundas embraced the whole tradition of Scottish philosophy. His rediscovered voice can now be heard again. And despite the non-existence of free will,